Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-host David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Albertan and Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy versus Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.com to register for updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly. On today's show, it's now been 10 and a half months since the Biden administration took over the White House, about 1 month since President Biden spoke at COP26 in Glasgow, 3 weeks since he signed a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill into law that includes billions for decarbonization projects, and 2.5 weeks since the U.S. House of Representatives approved a reconciliation package with over $550 billion in climate-related measures. It also includes $300 billion in tax credits alone for various low-carbon technologies. As context, that $300 billion number is about the size of the entire pre-COVID Canadian federal budget. What has this first year of Biden administration action on climate been about? Where are the Biden administration and the Democrats headed in the next year? Where will the problems lie in getting their agenda done? Today we have a great guest to help us answer those questions. Jody Freeman is a born and bred Canadian academic originally from Vancouver, who has lived and worked in the U.S. for decades. She is the Archibald Cox Professor of Law and a leading scholar of administrative environmental law at Harvard Law School. Jody is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the American College of Environmental Lawyers, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She also served as counselor for energy and climate change in the Obama White House from 2009 to 2010, where she had a big role in the Obama era's tightening of vehicle fuel efficiency standards. Overall, I found our conversation to be a lot of fun, though advance warning, we do geek out a bit on policy details. We hope you enjoy it. Now on to the show. So, let's start things off with this week's Energy versus Climate news and not news segment. And for that, it's over to Sarah.
Great. So I've got two stories. I think one is news and one we're going to debate whether or not it's news. So the first is the article that came out this morning from Rod Nichols that looks at the companies in Alberta that are receiving compensation under the Compliance Cost Containment Program, or CCP as it's abbreviated. So this is a program that was started when carbon pricing in Alberta transitioned from the ESCR system to the CCIR system. And this was under the previous Alberta government, the NDP government. And one of the big changes in the change from ESCR to CCIR was going from facility level benchmarks to product level benchmarks. So rather than paying carbon costs based on your previous emissions as a facility and the difference between those, you now pay them based on your difference from an overall benchmark. And, at the time, this was brought in basically because of concerns around impact of facing higher carbon costs, in particular for facilities that had very high emissions relative to the benchmark. So they were going to see a large increase in their costs. It was brought in, and if you actually go back to the original description of it, it was brought in as a transitional program. I think some of the logic behind that being that there was potential for an economic shock and there should be some transitional period. But what Rod's reporting shows is that over the last period, up until this year, there are a number of facilities that are still receiving these payments, and they basically come in the form of either direct extra allocation of free allowances for emissions, or the ability to use more offsets, which come at lower costs and have less value to the government of Alberta. So essentially a subsidy to these companies. And those include companies that are now this year dramatically increasing their dividend payouts to shareholders. And so I think this is in some ways it's not news that, the oil and gas industry is successful at maintaining and increasing subsidies. But I think it is news and has the potential, I think, to be news. One of the things I'm going to be looking for is with the renewed attention to this program, is the federal government going to raise the issue that the program no longer longer meets their backstop requirements for the federal carbon tax. So maybe David, over to you for other thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think in terms of practical outcome, that latter thing is the really interesting one. That at some point, if Alberta imposes carbon rules and then pays off the companies to minimize the impact of the carbon rules, at what point does the federal government say you're not actually meeting that minimum backstop? But for me, mostly, I just found this a total facepalm. It kind of reinforces the sense that the Alberta government is just not remotely serious. And even though there's clearly some ways in which they're going through the formal motions of being serious, you see something like this and it just seems like a joke. I'm, as I've said before on the show, building a house in Canmore. Should I apply for the housing cost containment measure because I'm building in an expensive place? Well, I'm a wealthy person building an expensive place. It would be completely ridiculous. And yet that is effectively what CNRL is doing.
Yeah. And David, I'm glad that you sort of fingered the blame on the Alberta government, because CNRL, to be clear, it's done nothing wrong.
Well,
it's just taking advantage of an existing program.
There's nothing wrong with
doing what it's bound to do.
Look, there's nothing wrong with me asking the government to bail out the cost of my building in Canmore. I should be free to ask them.
Sure.
It's just that their right answer is to laugh.
The massive design flaw is that program exists. Now, to be clear, CNRL lobbied hard to get that cost containment program in place. And you're right, and I found myself arguing this at a small dinner with the Natural Resources Minister recently, where I was coming down hard on the Alberta government, and lots of people are saying, no, they're genuine, they're trying. And I say, yes, but then you see something like this pop up and one just becomes completely cynical again.
Next segment.
All right. So the one that I think is open for debate is a new paper that came out in one of the Nature journals recently called Reframing Incentives for Climate Policy Action. And I thought it was a really nice piece of analysis and had some interesting results. So basically what the authors did, it was a couple of things. So looking at a set of scenarios of different kind of climate or energy transition scenarios out to 2070, looking at what kind of trajectories we're on, and then on that trajectory, asking what is the optimum strategy for different types of producers to take. So they looked at oil and gas producers from high-cost countries, from low-cost countries, as well as importers. And basically what they found, if you believe that we are on some sort of trajectory where there is an energy systems transformation, and the argument that they use is some of the most recent numbers in terms of growth of wind and solar, which are tracking, their sort of middle scenario. It's a 2.2 degree increase scenario. And what they find is that under that scenario, basically the OPEC nations are better off if they go for a sell-off. So they try to flood the market, get as much market share as possible at obviously lower costs. That's, perhaps maybe not surprising, but it has implications for higher cost producing countries like Canada, where under such a scenario, you might say, oh, well, that's fine. We could just be free riders, not reduce our emissions and produce our oil. But what they find is that actually taking a strategy of doing that, of pursuing the free ridership, comes at a disadvantage versus trying to actually decarbonize because of essentially losing that market share, ending up with stranded assets, and whatever kind of domestic production you retain through, increased domestic demand for that oil doesn't offset that global market share. And so to me, that, maybe I liked it because it confirms a general belief that I have, which is that the biggest impact on Canada's oil and gas companies is not going to be the domestic policies that we implement or don't implement, but rather what happens with the rest of the world's demand.
So where Sarah ended, I'm in 100% agreement with that last step. I think there's a part of the paper where I wanted to argue that paper was not news, because it felt to me like a bunch of academics using the academic rules of how you get papers published and how you cite and how you construct something that gets into Nature, which is a very doable thing. There's basically a recipe, trying to argue effectively that the energy transition is just happening, and that at this point it's more cost effective to just decarbonize. And that's the kind of some of the headline of the way that was reported. And I feel like I wish that was true. But the fact that you can publish papers that say it's true doesn't make it true. The reality is that while it is certainly, if you imagine a world where suddenly there was no climate problem, we suddenly invented tomorrow something that was free, had no environmental impacts, and took CO2 out of the air, so there was no climate problem, I think you'd actually still see a growth of solar and wind at a slower pace, eating into the edge of electricity generation in some places. But I don't think that means they're on a trajectory that would do anything like the kind of decarbonization we actually need.
It sounds to me a bit like a perfect world scenario. I know economists love to assume we have a perfect world, but if you go back to that preceding news segment, the governments and companies will find ways of ensuring that they still have market share while looking like they're complying with climate policy and following through on their commitments. They're still ensuring that even though you're in the high cost, high carbon quadrant, you don't actually have to move because the public will subsidize you to stay in that high cost, high carbon quadrant and still have market share. I'm a little skeptical.
Guess we'll see where it ends up. The part that gives me some confidence in it is that it actually doesn't require a lot of coordinated action, right? In some sense, markets or countries that have low cost production, wanting to flood the market and get market share is sort of a natural reaction. And so, if you follow the everybody sort of looking out for themselves model going into the future, I think that's what's unique about this story. But we're going to have to check back on energy versus climate in 20 years and see where we are.
20 years or 2 months. We'll keep an eye on it. Great. Thanks, Sarah and David. So let's bring Jody into the conversation and let's start that deep dive on U.S. policy. So, Jody, we've got 3 questions that you and I are going to run through in a primer-like way, and then we're going to bring Sarah and David back into the conversation. And the first question is, what has this first year of the Biden administration been when it comes to action on climate? What has it been about? And the sub-question, I guess, as part of that is, what kind of mess did they inherit after 4 years of Trump rollbacks? How extensive was that mess?
Yeah, I think I characterized this first year of the Biden administration as trying to reset after the Trump rollbacks and get on a pathway towards addressing in terms of mitigation policies and also dealing with adaptation and resilience in a forward-looking positive way. They sort of had to go and stop in its tracks the unraveling effort that the Trump administration was so committed to. And that was a very extensive unraveling of basically every climate regulation at the federal level, every commitment on climate that the federal government had made in the Obama years. And really what Biden sought to do is reset and restore a forward momentum. So it's a year of kind of stanching the flow and getting back on a positive pathway, but they are not completed. The rulemakings, the flow of activity out of the federal government has really just begun, and we'll have to see how the administration pursues it for the rest of its time in office. I will say, and we can talk more about this, that there have been some very positive steps on very key regulations that matter in the U.S. context. 3 key ones come to mind. One is carbon standards for cars and trucks for the transport sector, putting them back on a path that will be driving toward electrification of the passenger fleet. So this is a really important policy in U.S. domestic in the U.S. domestic context, because that's the main driving force of the transportation sector's reductions. The second policy I'd say they got started on that's really important is the announced or proposed methane rules to limit methane from oil and gas operations. This is the first rule to do that for both the new sources, but also the old existing sources. That's a lot of methane from those facilities. And the other third policy I'd mention that is really important going forward is the power sector. And the Environmental Protection Agency is beginning a process of putting a new rule back in place to control CO2 from the power sector. There's a long history behind all those rules that I can speak to, but I'd say getting the weaker Trump rules stopped in their tracks and moving forward with a new set of climate rules has been the most important pivot that we've seen of the last year. And the last piece is, of course, the Biden himself, but the administration in full force going to Glasgow and basically saying, we're back. The U.S. is back. We want to be in a leadership position on international climate negotiations. We're prepared to lead. Here's our pledge of 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. Here's how we're going to get there, and leading this new pledge on methane. So those are the big events of the last year. And then we can talk more about what went into each of them if you like.
Oh, I'd love to do that. And the power sector one has received quite a lot of attention up here because the Canadian federal government has followed suit and the last election promised a net zero grid by 2035 and has proposed a clean electricity standard for getting there. I will note, we don't need to get into it now, but I will note, notably absent in your three accomplishments is any talk about a federal carbon price, because we've been steeped up here and sold for multiple years that federal climate policy begins and ends with a federal carbon price. But let's now look ahead. Where are the Biden administration and the Democrats headed in the next year?
Well, before I get to that, can I make a comment on carbon pricing?
Please, yes, yeah, absolutely.
There's this long history of frustration about this in the United States context at the federal level. So I always talk about this as my analogy is Lucy in the football. From the Peanuts cartoon that, Charlie Brown always thinks he's going to kick that football and Lucy always yanks it away. And that is the story of the United States Congress, always looking like it might or tiptoeing up to the edge of maybe doing something comprehensive to control the emissions, the GHG emissions from the U.S. economy, and in the end, never quite getting it done. And once again, in the Obama years, we did this. We thought we could get a bill through the Congress. Now, this is when President Obama himself, of course, was in the White House and the Democrats controlled both chambers. And the climate bill that was being advanced at the time, which would have set a cap on economy-wide emissions, the descending cap over time, and done a bunch of other things to promote clean energy, did get through the House and failed in the Senate. So it never got passed. And it was against that backdrop that the Obama administration had to use all the tools in the toolbox that the president controls to get as much as possible done. And that is being replayed in the Biden administration. The Biden administration thought, of course, a 50-50 tie in the Senate is even harder than when the Obama administration had both chambers by some margin. But still, there was some hope that we could see a climate bill, or if not a climate bill, then maybe, as you just mentioned, a clean electricity program, just that, freestanding to controlled power sector emissions. And that's failed. That hasn't gotten over the finish line in these infrastructure bills that you've been describing. So it looks once again like nothing comprehensive is coming out of the U.S. Congress on greenhouse gas emissions. There are some very substantial incentives, investments, subsidies, as you mentioned at the top, billions and billions of dollars going into things like EV infrastructure, transmission grid, lots of good investments. But Congress seems to know how to spend money in the United States and is not so keen on anything that looks like binding standards. So once again, we're in this position where the administration has to use the tools in its toolbox, which we can talk about, federal agencies operating under old federal laws that were not passed specifically with climate in mind, and they're trying to make as much progress as they can.
Yeah. To use that Lucy in the football analogy, I was in D.C., and I think it was the Warner-Lieberman bill. It would have been, I want to say 2008, 2009. Yeah. And it was announced while I was there. And I remember going to NRDC and talking, someone to remain nameless, a senior executive said, this is absolutely going to get passed. Then I went over to Jason Grumet, the Bipartisan Policy Center, to talk to him. He's like, this is DOA. There's no way it's ever going to get done. Unfortunately, his view was right. So tell us now, what are the problems that they're going to hit in the next year? And this is broadly like the political fiscal challenges. You and I talked about in our pre-chat, everyone is annoyed with inflation and gas prices. COVID's back. It's a thing again. And you've got these important midterm elections coming up. So all those to me sound like speed bumps when it comes to the Biden administration and its climate agenda.
Yeah, it's a grumpy time. I don't know how it feels to you in Canada, but everybody's grumpy in the United States. And there's this deep divide in the country, and the culture wars have started up again. It's a really unpleasant, divided time here. And it's really hard to imagine bipartisan or even nonpartisan policy of any kind getting over the finish line. That's why people had so much promise for infrastructure, because everybody likes roads and bridges. They like broadband, and maybe we could have some success. And we have had. The Biden administration did manage to get this big, hard infrastructure bill through the Congress. But I would say you've hit it exactly right. There are lots of obstacles to significant progress on climate change. One of the obstacles is the fact that the Congress is pretty much out of action. And this is really important to emphasize that in the United States anyway, climate policy is being made by the federal government, if it's friendly and disposed toward climate action, as the Biden administration is, the federal government and the courts. And those are the two institutional actors shaping the United States climate policy, with the states playing an important role, filling in, supplementing state and local government that are interested in climate policy or clean energy policy, trying to play a significant role. And with business, some leaders in the private sector also making commitments on net zero and taking significant actions. But the real main impetus for climate policy is the federal government and the courts. And that's a very difficult terrain to be
like
on.
What could go wrong with that equation?
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember that the Trump administration rolled back every significant climate policy, but that is not fatal, because most of those executive actions can be undone and better policies can be put in place. That's something the presidents can do. The pendulum swings back and forth from administration to administration. But the one thing the Trump presidency managed to accomplish that is much more permanent feeling is to ensure that the Supreme Court would be conservative by a vote of about 6-3 in most of these cases that we care about in this domain. It's not a friendly court to ambitious regulation, particularly ambitious environmental regulation, where it looks like agencies are doing what the court would view as creative or ambitious things with laws that the court thinks were not designed for that. So I think right now, the way it looks down here is the biggest break on ambitious climate action coming from the federal government, likely to be the courts. There's also this general mood of grumpiness you talked about, which makes it hard to promote climate policy and talk about climate science in a way that can get any purchase, because people think that, well, if the Democrats believe that, then I'm going to be against that. Or if the Republicans believe that and you're a Democrat, then I'm going to be against that. So it's very hard to cut through and talk about science, fact, technology, policy. As somebody once told me long ago when I was in the White House, a real old political hand tapped me on the arm one day when I was making an argument for a policy and said, "Oh, Jody, you know, rationality is logic is for losers. Logic is for losers." And they were trying to be kind. They were trying to say, you don't understand, the politics is going to overwhelm this. Well, right now, the politics, the culture wars, the political divide is overwhelming a lot of important policy discussion. The other obstacle, I'll just note, is the impending 2022 midterms and the very real prospect that the Democrats will lose the House. I think most people think that's highly likely. There's some prospect might even lose the Senate. And that will be, a problem in a lot of ways that are hard to put your finger on, not just because we don't think we're getting climate legislation out of Congress anyway, but it makes it harder on the federal government as it goes to act, because there's a prospect of hearings and obstacles being put in the way of the agencies that come up the works from a potentially hostile Congress. So that is not a helpful piece. And I think too that the fact that inflation seems to be settling in for a little longer than people expected is making it harder to argue for anything that could possibly be portrayed as raising is what I have in mind as people's reaction, raising people's energy costs.
Yeah.
And so the context makes it hard to say, gas prices might go up a titch or electricity prices might go up, but this is not the right environment in which to be talking about that because of inflation.
Yeah. That, by the way, the logic is for losers anecdote. It really sounds like a scene right out of the West Wing. And if not President Bartlett, then one of the senior staff taking you aside. But yeah,
so funny. It's so funny because when I did my stint in government, I of course was naturally, you would expect I was a big fan back in the day of the West Wing. And, but I knew it was kind of a fantasy. And yet there were these days like that where you thought, I'm in an episode. This is absolutely.
Yeah. Well, So I'd love to do a deeper dive on the focus of your academic research, which is looking at some of those legal obstacles to clean energy strategies, the rules of the road that get in the way, and then bring David and Sarah into the conversation, because I know, David, the work that you're doing at Harvard is about trying to overcome those obstacles for the solutions that you're advocating for. But maybe...
But maybe I'll jump in with just a sharp or slightly different version of what you just asked, Jody, which is, Jody, if there is this big Supreme Court showdown over a energy climate policy in the next couple of years, what is it?
Well, I think it's coming, and it's coming this year, actually into the beginning of 2022. And that is, there is a holdover from the Trump administration, which is a very weak rule purporting to regulate power sector carbon emissions. So it was the Trump version of a carbon rule for electricity. And that replaced a much more ambitious Obama era rule. That Trump rule is a little complicated. So, bear with me here. That Trump rule, which is judged by most folks as requiring the power sector to do almost nothing. It's a very, very minimal rule, was based on an extremely anemic, narrow view of what the Environmental Protection Agency was permitted to do under the Clean Air Act. So the most prominent feature of that Trump policy was to take a view of self-abnegation. In other words, we don't have the legal authority to do much. And that Trump rule was struck down by the DC Circuit, which is the court just below the United States Supreme Court. So in a way, that was a gift to the Biden administration, because a weak Trump era rule was struck down as illegal, which cleaned the slate for the Biden folks to come in and say, okay, we're going to rethink this and put in place a more ambitious set of standards to control power sector emissions. But the problem is the Supreme Court granted review of the lower court's decision, striking down the Trump rule. Now, you may wonder, why would the court do that? It's old news. It's gone. The administration's gone. And the EPA hasn't even had a chance yet to design its own rule. So why not wait? Treat that as a dead issue. Why not wait and let the EPA design a rule for the power sector? And if people want to sue about it, great. Well, the reason is it looks like at least 4 members of the court, because that's all it takes to grant review, at least 4 members and maybe as many as 6 members of the court are champing at the bit to send a message to the Environmental Protection Agency that it better watch out if it tries to overreach. And what we might get from the Supreme Court, and this goes to your question, David, what could be a really consequential decision is if the Supreme Court takes this opportunity, even before the Biden EPA goes to design a set of standards, if it takes the opportunity to say, the way we read the law you're operating under, you have very little room to maneuver. And to clip the wings of the agency before it goes to fly. And that's the real question. What will happen going forward in this case? And will the agency be able to preserve the fundamental authority that it possesses to design standards that are meaningful, that will be effective, that can take into account technology trends, costs? They've never said that EPA under Biden has never said it wants to put the Obama policy back in place. In fact, in opposing this decision to grant review, in the brief opposing it, saying to the Supreme Court, don't take it, you don't need to take it, they said very clearly, we don't intend to go back to the Obama era standard. We're taking a narrow review, but that has not been enough to stop the court. So that's the long, legalistic, complicated answer. And what we're watching for, the initial briefs are due in this case December 13th. So all the people like me who follow this case are waiting to see how it shapes up.
Yeah, and if
my eyes glazed over a bit, but that was really useful.
Okay. But we go back to your fundamental equation that climate policy is made by the federal government and the courts.
Yeah.
To bring it back to a Canadian context, yes, the court has involvement in federal climate policy, and notably, it upheld the federal government's right to impose carbon pricing on provinces and also to recognize equivalency agreements, and it was fought to the Supreme Court by several provinces. But it's a much smaller part of that equation. Whereas what I hear you saying, the Supreme Court, it's like has equal weight. And while the Supreme Court may not be anti-climate per se, the Supreme Court is anti-big government getting bigger and anti-statist heavy-handed approaches to regulation. And a lot of what's being proposed in environmental regulation is that kind of statist heavy-handed approach. Do I have that right?
I resist. So let me just say, I resist a sort of simplistic characterization of what the court is for or not for, and they're anti this or anti that. I do think that the cases and the particularities of the cases matter. The details of the laws that the agencies are trying to implement matter. I do think that there's room to make arguments even to what is characterized as a conservative Supreme Court. There's room to make arguments that you can't read the law this way. It doesn't make sense, and here's why. And I think there's always the potential to persuade. That said, you have what a layperson would say is probably correct about the attitude of the court. And in particular, what I just emphasize about this is, look, if you're left making climate policy under laws from, the 1970s, like the Clean Air Act, which, while it's possible that it's completely capable of addressing climate change, was primarily focused at the time on ground level pollution. For the most part, the main problem at the moment was that the priority, not to say the statute can't address climate, but if that's your view, that there are these old laws on the books and an administration is trying to adapt them to these newer problems, the court has a resistance to that idea. And what it wants is Congress to speak clearly now. So they have a doctrine, a principle that's called the major questions canon, where they say, this is too big a deal. This is too major a set of issues. It has too much political, economic, social importance for us to allow you to exercise your authority using an interpretation that you're making of a very old law. So we want the Congress to speak clearly. And the problem with the doctrine is when your Congress is inert, when your Congress can't function, when the Congress is unable to pass significant updates to statutes of any kind, really, from privacy laws, right, to telecom laws, to climate laws, it's a recipe for total inaction and stasis.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'd love to chat about this U.S. approach. U.S. presidents and President Biden most recently mentioned it in your list of significant achievements, Jody. They go to COP meetings and they say, trust us. Well, we won't federally price carbon. We can get it done with investment. And the U.S. Congress knows how to spend. And we threw around those numbers in the trillions or $550 billion on climate measures alone in the Build Back Better framework. And we see now these stacks of tax credits. So let's say you want to produce hydrogen as an input to sustainable aviation fuel, then the renewable energy producer gets a tax credit. The hydrogen producer gets a tax credit. The operator capturing the carbon to make that low carbon hydrogen gets a tax credit. The sustainable aviation fuel producer gets a tax credit. You wonder if anyone actually pays taxes at the end of the day in the US. So it's spending and then is handing out tax credits like they're drunken sailors. So that's, again, the layperson's view. Is that effective? Like, is that going to help them achieve their ultimate GHG reduction outcomes?
First, a couple of things. First, what successive administrations, Obama, Biden, go into the international forum and do is they say, not just we're doing this through a series of investments that Congress is passing, they also say we can adopt rules that will cut emissions. That's why it's important that they proposed the car standards before they went to Copenhagen. That's why in the Obama years, it was important that we announced our standards for the car sector, for the transport sector, before we went at the time to the international meeting that the president first went to. So they do depend on having domestic authority and these spending vehicles. But I will say to you, first of all, not all these tax credits have been approved, right? The hard infrastructure bill put a lot of money, billions and billions of dollars into things like EV infrastructure and the grid. I've figured here $73 billion for the country's electric grid and for the power infrastructure. So that's a lot of money. But the tax credits, a whole bunch of other tax credits depend, I think, on the next bill getting through. But your general question is, how much good does this do? And, I don't know quite how to quantify that. Having significant support for the kinds of upgrades that we need, power, charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, for example, it's very hard to get that built. It's going to help. Get that built. It's going to help to upgrade the transmission infrastructure to get wind and solar brought from remote areas into the load centers where people consume that electricity. We do need all these upgrades. So I think it's helpful. But I think implicit in your question is a bunch of tax credits, is a lot of investment going to be enough? And I guess my own perspective is no, because the other side of the coin to go along with investments is the kind of standards that drive emissions down. And that's the regulatory piece that's missing. And that's what you need to rely on the government to do without a new piece of legislation authorizing it that could have made it more effective and more efficient.
So I do think that there are, maybe I'll just jump in. I think there are a few interesting examples, though, of how combining the federal government's spending power with the state's regulatory power has moved the needle in the past, right? So, we talked before about the Obama-era Clean Power Plan. Of course, it's worth noting that we've actually reached that target in the U.S., right? Like a decade before what the power plan had. And I think it's, a piece of that, at least, that, or some things that help to contribute to that are this combination of the ITC and PTC, the money that came from the federal government for wind and solar, the loan guarantees. And I mean, of course, I'm saying all things that Jody, well, having been part of that administration,
Yeah.
but
I'm glad you think they're all successful. I think actually it's a more complicated story. And I think David can jump in here too. I mean, I think probably the most powerful driver of emissions reductions in the power sector has been the availability of cheap natural gas that's outcompeted coal and displaced it. And the worry about making this argument that, well, this is the Manchin argument, by the way, Senator Manchin from West Virginia, this is his argument is they're going there anyway. Power sector's on the way anyway. You don't need any federal standards. You don't need to drive them. And I guess the point I would make is I think what we've seen simply demonstrates how much farther and further standards could have driven things, and how much faster we could get there if we had a federal underpinning to what the market is doing anyway.
Yeah, so don't get me wrong, it would be great to have that. And I just don't want to have the Manchin argument that we shouldn't. I guess it's sort of in the absence of that, though, when you do have big states that are making big moves, I think that there is, and certainly natural gas is a piece of that. But I think that there is also evidence now that the renewables are starting to eat into the natural gas demand and starting to eat into the coal demand as well, too. So I think that there is, that's one. I think on the EV side as well, the loan guarantee money for Tesla to set up their facility, which then they were able to sell cars into California because of the standards there and the value that created. Like, I guess it's not that it wouldn't be also good and we couldn't go faster if there was a coordinated federal effort. But I think in my mind, in the absence of that, you still are going to see things moving forwards. And so even if, we can't in the US see the same kind of coordinated effort that you necessarily see in Canada with a federal government that has, fewer sub-regions to try to get to agree, that that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be, fast pace of adoption.
Just to keep with the dynamic between you and I, Sarah, of glass half full and glass half empty, I had fun teaching an energy systems class at Harvard this fall, and we actually had a bunch of students looking in detail at what was in this new Infrastructure Act with regard to the transmission infrastructure. And Jody, you were talking about it helping to build out long-distance transmission for solar and wind. My read is very little of it. It's really mostly about resiliency against wind and other events to reduce outages. And it does a comparatively tiny amount of what you need to really build out more long distance transmission to enable deeper penetration.
And to add to that a little more negativity, just the problem with transmission is not that it is funding. The most important problem is siting. And siting is in the control of the states, and they operate under, talk about law as obstacle. They operate under statutes that prioritize certain local needs and actually may not permit them in some instances to approve and pay for lines that they don't benefit sufficiently from. So if they're in a state that's not getting the electricity, but that's just kind of a flyover state or a pass-through state, there are real obstacles to them approving them. So we have lots of problems beyond money that have to do with the legal authority to cite things and get things done. The other thing I just say is I'm a big fan of states taking action, and states like California pride themselves on being leaders, and New York and some others. But, it's not enough. It's not a majority of the country. There are real obstacles in the way of states taking unilateral action, because to the extent they impose their policies that has an economic impact on other states, there may be constitutional problems with that. So again, I agree with you. That's a lot better than nothing. And they keep things humming when the federal government is out of action. And states are really important places for experimenting with policy, experimenting with carbon pricing, experimenting with renewable portfolio standards. But if you don't have for this problem, for climate change, if you don't have for this problem an active, engaged federal government that's imposing some kind of equivalent of a carbon price to drive things forward, I think everything becomes a hodgepodge of second and third best policies that both are less effective than we want them to be, and more expensive than we want them to be.
Yeah. And Jody, we get kind of perverse outcomes out here on climate policy because of that jurisdictional division of powers. So you've got a federal government that followed the Biden administration's lead with the 2035 net zero grid commitment and is willing to spend by Canadian standards like drunken sailors to help get more wind and solar on the grid and increasingly battery storage to provide grid resilience and grid services. And then you've got a province where David, Sarah, and I live, Alberta, which is actively blocking federal investments in beefing up wind and solar in some cases because they're worried about transmission infrastructure and they're worried about investing, but then passing on the cost to the ratepayer to build the additional transmission infrastructure that you need to connect to those new wind and solar and storage projects. And so it's like a Mexican standoff. And what happens is the grid stays the way it is and the money doesn't get spent.
So I think the transmission line problem is the tricky one, right? And there I'll join in the pessimistic team about getting those things actually built. But I think that, the wind and solar is a great example where the level of support for wind and solar in conservative states in the US is much higher than, and I think we're starting to get there, frankly, in Alberta. But I think historically it's been higher there than it has been here. And that there are now a number of auto manufacturers and battery manufacturers that are making big investments in facilities, in production facilities in traditionally, red and conservative and swing states in the US. And I think that goes a long way to getting support from a broader coalition, right? And so, Alberta, like we sort of, I feel sometimes like we're last behind even the conservative states in the US on this specific topic. And so there's a little bit of optimism that there are other places where this is going faster.
And listen, I'm gonna be the timekeeper. I'm gonna interrupt because I want us to get to a discussion of policy resilience before we get to audience Q&A. And we're gonna go through a thought experiment. And the thought experiment is the Democrats lose the House, as you muse is possible if not likely in 2022. They could lose the Senate. Let's say they lose the presidency in 2024, and you've got Republicans continuing to be mostly hostile to Biden and Obama era action on climate. So if you're a Democrat right now and you're doing all these things and you don't want it to be, basically a 2-year fling, how do you make your policy durable? And how do you make it durable so that if you have a hostile Supreme Court, it survives court actions and it survives President Trump 2.0 from overturning things with executive orders?
Okay, so a couple things to that. Trying to make climate rules legally durable is something I care a lot about. I'm deeply involved in, and I agree with you completely. You want to make it harder to undo things. And the best way to do that is to build a really strong record on technology and cost that it would be very hard for a new administration to come in and say isn't true anymore. And to say that industry can't get there because what you've got in the record is clear evidence that the technology is outpacing what people think can be done, that the industry can actually comply, that it can meet these standards. And so I think what the Biden administration is doing at the moment is actually being very careful and thoughtful about building really robust records to support their new climate rules. For example, the methane reg. So they are taking the time necessary to put in place all of the data, technology analysis, modeling that will show, look, we have drones and sensors and satellites available to detect and to monitor methane emissions. Here's what the industry can do. Here's the cost to do it. And in that sense, it will make it harder for a new administration to claim otherwise. And that's the kind of effort you have to make in making rules durable. I will say one more thing, and you might want to circle back to it or questions may come about it. I do think in the scenario you painted there, where the Democrats have neither the presidency nor either chamber of Congress, I do think climate policy suffers a very significant setback. And then you look to the states and you hope that more states are willing to make the kinds of commitments and investments, not even because they necessarily care about climate change or are willing to talk about climate change, but because there are good economic drivers for wind and solar energy. Their states have the resources. They can make money on this. And that's the kind of thing you'd be looking for, is more state activity and more private sector activity. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to have the private sector playing a leading role.
Yeah. And so are you looking, I just want to ask a specific example. Sorry, like the 45Q was strengthened under the Trump presidency. And I'm still unclear. Is that because it flew under the radar, or the Trump presidency looked at it and said, hey, carbon capture makes sense and we should be paying on a per ton basis. It's using the tax system to drive environmental outcomes. Okay, we can live with that. And by extension, we can have more measures like that we can live with.
So I'm about to be embarrassed to say I don't know what 45Q is. I forgive me. You'll have to edit this out. What's 45?
Sorry, the section 45Q in the U.S. tax code, which provides a per ton incentive for for carbon capture, and then it's got a new level for direct air capture as well.
Oh, pardon me. So yeah, I mean, first of all, there's a lot of Republican support for energy efficiency. Number one, there's also a lot of Republican support for carbon capture, but we have a long way to go on carbon capture. So you might see some of those policies, but the rest of what would drive that forward won't be in place. I would predict in a Republican administration, where you'd need to put in place rules of the road, like liability rules to make carbon capture work. You'd need to have, sort out who owns the pore space where you're going to put all this stuff. I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to be done beyond just those kind of incentives. You can edit that out, because when you're a Harvard professor, not knowing the section of the tax code you're talking about.
No, you get big credit for admitting you don't know something. That's the score.
Yeah. All right, Sarah, for comment, and then we're going to go to Q&A.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, what I would do if I was in charge now and could try to make things durable. And I think that beyond what Jody was saying on the industry side, when I look at the transport sector and the power sector, I think in the power sector, you do everything you can to get steel in the ground on some of those transmission lines, acknowledging that it's going to be really hard, but whatever is possible. And then I think on the transport side, similarly to your point, Jody, about the private sector, I think that's so key here, right? Because once you start these companies down this road of we are going to produce EVs, not internal combustion engine vehicles, it's really hard for a future administration to turn that around, right? And we saw that with the coal phase out in Alberta, where, there was no walking back on that. And I would argue that, again, I guess I'm just being the optimist or trying to help Ed's mom or something, but that we're down that road a far way on EVs. And, yes, we could go faster, and yes, policies will make that go faster, but Daimler is not developing any new internal combustion engines anymore, right? There is no future engine for car companies to buy if they wanted to buy them. And they are really, I think, to a certain extent committed to going electric, not because, they care about the environment, but because they know that the majority of people want their next car to be electric, and they want to continue to be able to sell cars to them. So I guess I have some hope that we are, further down that road, that even in that kind of nightmare scenario that Ed describes, where I don't know if Trump is president again or what's happening exactly, but I think at least when it comes to electrification of transport, maybe there's some reason for hope.
All right, thanks, Sarah. You've just made my family Christmas dinner merrier by giving yet another shout out to me old Welsh mum. So we're gonna get to Q&A right now. And
I have to say one more thing. I'm sorry.
Jump in. Go ahead, Jody.
When I was talking about industry leadership, I should disclose, because it didn't come up in the intro, I want people to understand part of my bio is not just working at Harvard, and I'm working in the White House on these issues, but I also serve on the board. I'm an independent director of ConocoPhillips. And in that role, have been able to see these issues from inside a boardroom in the oil and gas industry, which is really, really fascinating. And I think really important to have a voice like mine in a boardroom like that. And we can talk about that, but I only make the point because I think that when you're talking about what happens if the government doesn't look a certain way, you need to create coalitions and alliances, even with the industries that you may think are responsible for the problem, and perhaps especially with those industries. So I'm an advocate for that, and I just want to make sure that was out there.
No, it's good. Good point. And if you want to split a room with David, Sarah, and myself down the middle very quickly, we'll talk about the role of oil and gas companies in climate action. But on that note, we have Ed Brost, who I got to know Ed when he was with Shell Canada, where he spent, Ed, correct me if I'm wrong, the bulk of his career. And Ed Brost has a question. So Ed, welcome.
Thanks, Ed. My question is for Jody, and you have been talking a lot about political support on both sides of the aisle, but especially trying to get the Republicans on board. My question is, are there any Republican outliers in the Senate and the House who might break from their party line and to give Democrats the opportunity to say that they have bipartisan support for any given initiative? And if there are some names out there, is there any lobbying efforts or any activity underway to make it so?
You mean on climate policy?
Sorry, yes.
Yeah. It's very tough right now. Mitch McConnell is a supremely effective leader, Senate minority leader, and he's got a pretty tight control of his caucus. It looks like breaking away is extremely costly. I will say, it appears that it's extremely costly, and I think the theory of the case is if they hold the line and nothing gets done, they'll take credit for that and be able to run on the fact that they prevented an administration from imposing costs on the economy and society. And they seem to have made a bet in that regard. And it's politics. It's not policy. So I think my short answer to your question is no, there doesn't seem to be much prospect of bipartisan cooperation. The best chance was on infrastructure. And it is a success to have gotten a hard infrastructure bill done. But I don't see a lot of other opportunities for cooperation, not even on raising the debt ceiling of the United States, not even to prevent defaulting on the obligations of the United States. So that it's a very challenging moment in American politics.
Yeah. And is that symptomatic just of the culture wars, or is that rather symptomatic? Is that an extension of the culture wars? Because it's tough here, but not to that degree. And I must admit, looking stateside from up here, it just seems befuddling.
I'll tell you, it's supremely disheartening, even in the 10 or so years since I did my time in the federal government. Even in a short time span like that, I feel like things have very rapidly deteriorated to the point where you're for them or against them. You're with us or you're against us. Issues that ought to be issues we can discuss rationally become mired in a kind of cultural and political divide that makes it impossible. The experience of COVID down in the United States, I don't know if you're experiencing the same thing in Canada. My folks who live in Vancouver report to me that, Canada, generally speaking, is, citizens of the country are trying to do their bit and getting vaccinated for the most part and behaving. And, in the United States, there's such a divide over everything from masks to vaccination. And David can speak to that too, that climate is just another one of these issues that is absolutely intertwined with whether you're on one team or another team. And it's stopped being something you can talk about rationally.
Gotcha. Okay. We've got another question from Peter Falloon. Thanks for your question, Peter. He writes, Jody, assuming that you're optimistic that the USA will play a meaningful, positive role in climate change, where's their momentum they should build on?
Where is their momentum in the US they should build on?
I think you could take this as momentum in the US to build upon, or you could look at momentum internationally, momentum that will help the Biden administration to keep trucking.
So here's the thing. I actually am, even though I come up with pessimistic points now and then, I'm kind of a closet optimist. And, there's a lot going on that's really impressive. And David can speak to this perhaps better than I can, but the world of tech is just so amazing and impressive and fast moving. And the way that costs are coming down for renewable technologies and the progress being made on batteries and storage. I think there's just huge potential for technology breakthroughs and improvements. And I think that's really promising for the prospect of climate.
I'll try and take a long toke and make a positive. I mean, I feel like
just don't inhale, David. Don't inhale.
We've gone from 3 martini lunches to.
I think the underlying thing is there's, by lots of measures, in industry and in the public at large, much more interest in climate action. I think that is really a robust fact. And so one of the ways I think things happen is that we get the right Republican administration. Because I think, of course, we don't know. Maybe it is Trump too. But there are versions of what happens next where we get some Republican administration, but they feel like in order to win, they have to be willing to do something on climate, even if it's really spun in quite a different way. And that because they're coming at it from the right, and the same as the Nixon in China or George Bush, the first denuclearizing intermediate range weapons in Europe, you get a thing where it's actually easier to make that compromise from the Republican side and you get some action. You think that's a total fantasy, Jody?
Well, it's interesting. I think we thought that about George W. Bush. George W. Bush ran and he actually competed with Al Gore when they were running for the White House. He took some of the issues away from Al Gore. He said, he basically supported the Kyoto Protocol. He supported trying to set standards for carbon for the power sector. I mean, he ran on all these things. And he's the guy who went into Congress in a State of the Union speech and said the era of big oil is over, or dependence on our addiction to oil is over. I forget the exact quote, but it was a moment when you thought, oh, a Republican president could actually lead the way toward decarbonization. And of course, that wasn't to be. Instead, he, officially withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol. He renounced his position on regulating power sector emissions, and that was the end of that. And so this era, I think, there's even less prospect. I think the Republican base now is so in the grip of Trump that you can't get the nomination unless you appeal to the very far right fringe of the party. And that's what I worry about. But I still think there's a lot of positivity. I think the states, back to Sarah, the states are doing all kinds of things that are really interesting. The business leadership is coming through with a lot of commitments about net zero. Now we have to figure out what net zero means for those businesses, help them figure out how they're going to get there. And I think that a combination of technology, market, private sector, state and local government will keep the U.S. moving forward until the federal government sorts itself out.
Yeah. And just to be clear, like this partisan divide that we're seeing, this is one glaring but recent difference between the U.S. and Canada. And I say that we had that glaring divide between, say, the Liberals, the NDP, all the other parties, and the Conservative Party of Canada until the last election. And there are lots of flaws in it, but the Conservative Party of Canada came out with a climate plan that could get to Canada's international COP target at that time. The Trudeau government cleverly moved the goalposts right after that. But it was a significant step forward so that every single major party in the federal system now has a climate plan that is at least okay. And no longer, I think, will we have federal elections where you'll have one that's got a plan that's terrible and the rest have very progressive plans. Let's get one more question in, and looking at it, we've got Victor, and then we're going to go to Jody for a quick response, and then we're going to try to wrap on time here, 30 minutes past the hour. Victor, over to you.
Oh, thank you all for taking my question. I also live in Alberta, so keeping that perspective in mind, but it feels like I live in Texas sometimes. Although I hear Texas has huge amounts of wind energy, putting us to shame. In any case, my question is about carbon pricing. So it looks like Canada is moving forward with carbon pricing. We'll see how Alberta does. But overall, Canada is moving forward with it, whereas it looks like in the U.S., you won't have carbon pricing anytime soon, according to what I heard today. So my question is, how will these events affect Canadian competitiveness, the industry, various industries, and what effect will it have on border carbon adjustments, which I hear are going to be coming? Certainly the Europeans are moving forward on it. How will this affect the border carbon pricing adjustments?
Great. Over to you, Jody. And to add to the challenge of that question, answer in 60 seconds or less. I feel like I'm a radio following.
I feel like punting this one to David. I don't know what you think the effect is going to be. I certainly agree that there's not going to be a federal carbon price in the U.S., but we do have some state level carbon pricing experiments going on. What do you think the effect's going to be?
I don't think the real battle about real carbon price adjustments, I think that's still an election cycle ahead on both places. I think this is still mostly in the academic world, those rules.
Border tariff.
Yeah. And Sarah has reminded me on the chat what we talked about, the news, not news segment. So yes, there's a carbon price. There's a federal system, the output-based pricing system. There are all sorts of allocations and exemptions federally and provincially to try to protect competitiveness. And from the very moment, day one, they started talking about national carbon price, they talked about ensuring that Canadian industry stays competitive.
And what do you do with that money, right? It doesn't go up in smoke. So I think it depends a lot on how Canada spends it. It doesn't have to make our industries uncompetitive.
Look, I think the whole lesson of this, the conclusion I would come up with, and my 10-second conclusion is, everybody has to do their job. Industry has to do its job articulating how they're going to be competitive in a lower carbon economy and has to be leaders. We need leadership from the private sector. State and local governments, provincial governments have to do their job. And the federal governments have to do their job, which is some kind of carbon pricing or carbon cap that is the foundation for all the rest of this policy going forward. And the idea that you can just use supply side measures and demand that the oil and gas companies go out of business without dealing at all with the demand side, I don't think that's a workable regime for solving this problem.
We'll leave it at that. Thank you. And big thank you to Jody. It was wonderful to have you as a guest. And once again, to bring that cross-border transnational perspective, we're really grateful.
Thanks.
Now, final comments. Reminder that this episode will be available at energyversusclimate.com for reviewing. Please rate us when you use your podcatcher. Our next episode will be in early February. Topic and guest TBD. Give us feedback at energyversusclimate@gmail.com. Support us at energyversusclimate.com. We're actually in the midst of our first listener appeal. It helps to pay for some of our production costs. We look forward to seeing you again in early 2022. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Voinigescu. Mika McFarlane provides webinar support. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com. Interact with us live every other week and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen.